If you could all kindly turn your cell phones off, we'll begin shortly. Thank you. If you look in front of you, you all have a little flyer on the Arabic Immersion program. It's a new program the AIC is launching for this summer. Immersion program is a little different than the intensive programs in that students will also have the opportunity to engage in practical activities, which so they'll be forced to kind of utilize the language in several clubs, like journalism club, Quranic studies, Arabic calligraphy, literature club, you name it. So it's a really great way to make learning the language fun. In addition to that, they'll have an intensive 160 hours of instruction over a span of 2 months. So I think this is a really great way to immerse oneself in the language and culture of the Arab world and Islam. So please, if you know anybody who's interested, feel free to pass those postcards along. Greatly appreciate it. Now, I'd just like to present you a short video clip on the American Islamic College. You want to hit the lights for me? Did you hear it?
Institution. It sees itself as part of the fabric of the larger community here in the Chicagoland area. And I do believe by opening its doors to its neighbors, to citizens at large, for events and for lecture series, conferences, etc., it will play a very significant and critical role in bridging the gap between Muslim Americans and their neighbors, and to move forward in the future to build on a common culture of values, higher values that we all share.
I want a balanced learning environment and something that really prepares me for the real world. I want to learn trade and I want to learn skills, but I also need to understand things from a more dynamic perspective.
Really no good venue for an Islamically based liberal college and dialogue venue. A big part of that, of what a college can do for me, is not only teach me about, I guess just book things and like that, but also the underlying concepts and what it means to interact with people across, across borders and things like that. People who you aren't familiar with and cultures that you're not familiar with, and really gain insight into that. Definitely, as a Muslim college-age student, the prospect of being able to attend a liberal arts college that functions under an Islamic idea is really exciting, and I think would be just such a meeting point and a great venue for Muslim and non-Muslim students.
There are many Islamic institutions in the United States. There are many cultural centers and mosques, but the AIC is unique. It's the first Islamic university in the United States.
I hope that the American Islamic College now will be able to do something new, to realize those hopes, those great hopes of which it was founded, and really create the kind of college and imam training institute where people can go deep in their own faith, but then also learn then how to flourish, how to serve.
I do think it's exciting. I remember when it was opened again, and there were banners all over near the area, and they were inviting actually their neighbors in. And what I find incredibly exciting about that is the neighbors wanted to come and join them. And so learning about the interfaith garden that was planted there, it's not just about academics necessarily or these really important conferences, but also about creating relationships through connecting together over preserving the environment.
I love the fact that there's so many people from different traditions here. So I think this is the solution, is people coming together from across all sorts of backgrounds and working together on a project.
Its impact
goes both ways, educating the American Muslim community about Muslims worldwide, but also educating fellow Americans and world citizens about Islam both in the United States and globally.
Students and scholars from different faith groups come to the AIC where they can meet and they can study and they can discuss issues of importance to our community, to the community at large, to our cities and nations. And we can have serious discussion and output coming from the AIC.
This year we've been working very diligently to become accredited with the Illinois Board of Higher Education. We submitted our application in January of 2011, and we hope to be hearing back very soon and achieving our operating authority, which means that we can offer classes for credit for students.
We have just completed 1 full year of academic courses in Islamic studies, Quranic studies, Hadith and Sirah, art courses such as Eboo, which is a Turkish art form of water marbling, and Arabic calligraphy.
You know, it's a symbol to the world that there can be interfaith dialogue and there can be this coexistence of culture and religion, and that's especially important for the shrinking globe.
Being able to achieve a liberal arts degree or a bachelor's degree, just like any other college, under a more Islamic umbrella would be a really neat thing.
In all of our communities, a college that is as well located and endowed and as beautiful as this one is, we really have an obligation to stand by Dr. Ali Yusuf and his team and to take advantage of this great blessing that has been given us and to bring it to fruition.
That this institution can do great things, not only for the Muslim community in Chicago and beyond, but also for the country as a whole.
AIC is not just an Islamic college, it's a Chicago institution. It is very much part of the fabric of Chicago. It sees itself as part of the larger community. So it extends itself out to its neighbors, to its friends, and invites the public at large for events and opportunities. And I do believe that it will play a very important role in terms of the future of Muslim-American relations in Chicago and in the United States.
I just learned our speaker is running a little late, about 5 minutes. I do apologize. So please feel free to get some more food and enjoy conversation, and we'll begin shortly. Thank you.
I said, well, why would he come, you know? He was paying for 7 hours. And you know, I said, why would he come and pay for 7 hours? I said, I'm okay, I'll come. No, that's because my husband was paying for it. It's the antisocial. Yeah, you better always stay home before the computer. You have to drag him out.
Even though like he comes, I'm sure he's gonna just get on my phone.
Exactly. He's with the phone now. He's opening a game and stuff.
He has like 10 pages.
Your guys are new?
Yes.
Are these new? Do you have different ones? Yeah, because these look different to me. I like it how you have them.
And I do too. But I have pictures like this one because it's big and they don't have my size. I buy online.
Belki.
O geliyor sonra.
Ama belki. Ama anneanneler falan da olacak. Sümeyye ailece. Yok yani. Hani açılırsa gireriz.
Yani
Kim çalışacak sonra?
o yüzden.
Bizler ben aslında alabilirim yani. No, it's not. So you have to come.
But that's not even is it taking
Just please stop recording right now. I'm not recording. You can start later.
there will be like 2 videos. People mostly wait
Very fascinating.
She's like covering here.
I really want you guys to understand. Since I didn't pay attention to myself, so, you know, I'm very clumsy and then I don't pay attention.
Nice fashion.
You know, like something shows, but I don't realize my husband gets so pissed off. You know what you stuff, you know. You know what you said, you know what Sen rahatlıyım ya. Bunda oturmama kalkmama gidiyorum. Mesela sırtım açılıyor diye.
Ben aslında yani eşim öyle söylüyor.
Sen hiç almışsın o yüzden bir şey demiyor. Sabah sadece su yiyorsun, sıcak yiyorsun. My elbow might step in one of the always need to stop. I don't know, it's easy to find someone when I say to my desktop, I have my chocolate. And it's small together.
But when I like go on my programs, they always name very properly and I always place in the right folder.
Oh, I've got that.
I don't have patience.
Let's do one day with you. Now let's do Mr. Sushi with you guys.
Serious?
Oh, I know. You're Japanese. If you say it's gross, then it's gross. No, I don't eat raw fish. I eat rolls. Oh, that's what I call sushi. Fake sushi. I cannot eat yet to eat sushi.
Good evening. We're ready to start. Thank you for your patience. Tonight we have with us distinguished guest, Mr. Nizamuddin, who will be speaking on why everyone should know the Ottomans. Professor Nizamuddin is adjunct professor at Loyola University of Chicago. He has lectured on various aspects of interreligious dialogue and Islamic thought and history. He has been involved in interreligious dialogue for over 20 years. Recently, he was invited to give the annual response to the Forum on World's Religions and Interreligious Dialogue by the Theological Consortium of Greater Columbus, along with Bishop Demetrios of Mokissos. He was also invited to deliver a paper alongside Dr. Eboo Patel at the Second Interreligious Dialogue Conference in Istanbul, Turkey. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Nizamuddin.
Good evening, and may peace be upon you all. Thank you for being patient. The traffic out of O'Hare was really terrible today, so thank you for waiting around. Today's talk is really intended to just give you a little bit of a flavor of what we call basically an overview of Ottoman history. Now, those of you who may be familiar with the Ottoman Empire understand that when we talk about empires, they're really not what we call monolithic entities, meaning one aspect, whether it's political, economic, social, religious, or any other way. And the empire itself is extremely complicated, very complex, and moreover, it was an empire that lasted nearly 6 centuries. So it's a very long time. So to be able to give, an overview today about the entirety is really impossible. And it's really, we're just going to be giving you a few drops, so to speak, of the massive sort of waters of the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, it's intended to get your interest so that perhaps we can develop a course here at the American Islamic College on Ottoman history, perhaps a semester-long or a year-long course that will provide a survey over different aspects of the Ottoman Empire. So with that introduction, let me just give you, first of all, most of you are already familiar with different aspects of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in America and the United States. For example, everybody has something very common for breakfast nowadays, donuts, bagels, but also yogurt. Okay? Yogurt comes from Central Asia, and it came through the rest of the world through the Ottomans. Early, almost 1,000 years ago. And in particular, you may have had Dannon yogurt. Well, Dannon yogurt actually was started by an Ottoman Jew after World War I, who started the company in Spain and then moved his company to New York. So the Ottoman Empire really gave birth to not only yogurt generally, but also specifically to Dannon yogurt. Okay, another sort of famous meals, it's dinner time, so I thought I'd start with meals, is what we call in Chicago gyros, okay, but which is known as in the Arab world, shawarma, but more particularly in Anatolia and Turkey, doner kebab. Doner kebab, gyros, shawarma was invented in the 1880s. We can even trace it to the city of Bursa, which was the initial capital of the Ottoman Empire by the Effendi family. And after the demise of the Ottomans in the 1920s, ultimately it came to the United States through the Greek community, which they call as gyro, which refers to the gyrating meat, and so forth. And let's not forget the flower, the tulip. All of you are familiar with tulips. They're beautiful. It's been part of American culture, Western music, tiptoed through the tulips by the very eccentric person by the name of Tiny Tim in the 60s was a very famous song in American pop culture. But the tulip became commercialized by the Ottomans. In fact, there's a very important era of culture and art in the Ottoman period known as the Tulip era, which gave rise to all kinds of different artwork, particularly in architecture. You'll find some of the great mosques in Istanbul are full of tiles, beautifully painted tiles that have the tulip as an important design. Okay, so that's sort of the cultural aspects of the Ottoman Empire that you're familiar with. Two issues that also you're familiar with, because they're always in the news, of course, is the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which begins, obviously, in the early part of the 20th century. But it has its roots, ultimately, in the destruction, to a certain extent, of the Ottoman Empire, which then gives rise to various kinds of mandate system that develops by the victors of World War I, culminating in various nation-states that have given birth for the first time, such as countries like Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, etc. And then finally, in the 1990s, something more recent is the whole issue of the Balkan tragedy, which took place in the 1990s, giving rise to the first post-World War II genocide that took place in Europe. And this was really an aspect of old grievances that took place in the 1990s. And the Bosnian Muslims who suffered genocide at the hands, namely by Serb nationalists, were viewed as Turks. They weren't viewed as legitimate Slavs by the Serbian nationalists like Slobodan Milosevic and others who promoted this idea of a pure Serbian race that is Christian at its core, and they viewed these sort of interlocutors who came into the Balkans as Turks, even though they've been Bosnians for centuries. Okay, so that sort of gives you a flavor of the sort of relative importance at the cultural level, historical level, as well as the political level of the Ottoman Empire. Let's talk a little about something called historiography. What is historiography? Historiography is the approach that we utilize to understand history. It consists of either methods, okay, or the tools or the sources that we look to understand history. So when you all studied, for example, in grammar school in history, right, and we study the history of the United States, okay, what's the first thing you learn about? Okay, what about the United States? Right, so you learn about the Revolutionary War. What else? The Civil War. Okay, what else? Declaration of Independence, right? The War of 1812, right? And who do you usually learn about? What personalities? Okay, men. Usually men, right? That's true. Well, once in a while you throw in Betsy Ross, right? So men, what else? Who? Okay. So presidents, right? You learn about the presidents, famous men, presidents, rulers. In other words, the sort of political leaders, correct? Okay. So that's a certain way that history was taught for a long time, particularly in Europe and North America. In other words, we begin with military events, okay? Wars. Who won? Why did they win? And then you learn about the valor of these individuals who won these wars, right? So you learn about the bravery of, Washington crossing the Delaware in that boat, leading his men in battle, et cetera, and so forth. So the political history, the military history of peoples is the way that we typically learned history in the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. Later, and we utilize typically chronicles written by the victors, people who working for the state or the sort of ambassadors for the state, or even some political leaders. So we might read about, for example, what Benjamin Franklin wrote, or what Thomas Jefferson wrote, or whoever. Okay, that's how history was taught. But a shift took place dramatically in the middle of the 20th century, in late, particularly after World War II, where people said, well, this is all well and good, but I think it's more important to learn about different people within a particular area or a particular geographic location. So they started looking at other sources of history besides chronicles, okay? And besides certain documents called a Mirror of Princes. For example, a Mirror of Princes is basically a group of literature that is written by advisors to the prince or the king or whoever is in charge. So one of the more famous Mirror for Princes in Western literary tradition, of course, is The Prince by Machiavelli. But these predate Machiavelli. So Ghazali, for example, the famous Abu Hamid al-Ghazali wrote a very famous document giving advice to his leader, along with his Grand Vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. Later on, other sources were used, such as diaries, treatises, other legal documents, etc. Okay? Now, that's some of the sources. What about the methodologies? How do we sort of look at history? How do we judge history? Historically, again, in the 19th century, early 20th century, there was always a view about certain empires, whether it's the Islamic Empire, whether it's the Turkish Empire, or perhaps the Roman Empire. And there's always this view that there was a certain golden age that existed, and then after the golden age, that certain empire had a decline, and that was it. And that decline, they really didn't offer anything, there was really nothing important, etc. Now, questions that historians ask is that really true? Is there such a thing as a golden age? Whether it's in terms of art, literature, science, thought, or even military prowess. Is there such a thing as a golden age? And they began to question and really deconstruct that issue. The other issues that come up in history, particularly when it comes to Islamic history, is the notion of conquest and conversion. A lot of the histories, particularly in the English and Western languages about the Ottoman Empire or Islamic empires in the late 19th, early 20th century, sort of co-opted the notions of conversion and conquest together. So that the idea was that these Muslims came out of Arabia with their swords wielding, marching on horses or camels, and basically conquering and then converting the masses by force. And you see that still even in today's society with a lot of rhetoric in certain areas and so forth. Of course, these were sort of generalizations that were made by either political actors or those who are promoting a particular political agenda. But scholars have really concluded that we need to make a distinction between territories that were conquered, politically speaking, and then the rate of conversions at a certain area of land took place. So, for example, Richard Bullitt from Columbia University actually conducted a quantifiable study in the late 70s, and he concluded that when the Muslims conquered Persia, for example, it took approximately that area, the Iranian area, to about 350 years to convert to Islam, which sort of undermines this notion of people slaughtering people and conquering them and converting them. And the same can be said of the Ottomans as well. What about the notion of a unified monolithic state, such as the Ottoman Empire? Was it purely a Turkish-based ethnic state that was governing all these non-Turks? Well, in history, when we review the social elements, the social elites, and even some of the political elites of the Ottoman Empire, we recognize that the Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic state consisting of not only Turkish people of language or culture, but also Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and later on Arabs, some Persians, Kurds, and of course people from the Balkans, etc. And these were not only people who were within the empire living at the lower strata of economic and political life, but they were actually part of the administration of the Ottomans. So some became very important pashas or viziers or advisors to the sultans, particularly in the high period of the 15th, 16th, 17th century. There's many other themes that we can talk about. I'm going to skip over because of lack of time and get into the history. But another important theory is that was sort of discussed in the 50s and 60s in scholarship was the notion of modernization theory, which is the notion that the Ottoman Empire crumbled or did not survive because it's inevitable that traditional societies will become modern. But modern is what we mean is westernized. So the notion that when Turkey became a republic in 1920s and adopted secular ideas within its system, that was an inevitable reaction to the demise of the sort of old, patriarchal, traditional Ottoman society. That issue of modernization has been sort of undermined by scholars in the 70s and 80s. Okay? So let me go ahead and just get into history, but just mention one thing about the study of history from the scholarly perspective. Much of what you read about the Ottomans and the Turks, again, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, were written by Western sources. Sources from either British, Venetian, Genoese, Austrian, other chronicles, and political writings in the Western languages, English, French, German, etc., and so forth. However, later on, people then used the Turkish chronicles written by the political elite. But after World War II, an incredible treasure trove of documents was discovered, or I should say really released to scholars, and that was known as the Ottoman Archives, which is found in various places, but the vast majority of which are in in Istanbul. Which means that scholars now from both within Turkey, but also in Europe and anywhere really, can go and look into and investigate and research these archives that are available. You have to get permission from the government, of course. But as you can see from this slide here, there's a multitude of different areas that are cataloged with respect to the different aspects of the empire you can study. You can study the waqfs or the religious endowments, the judicial affairs, police, public works, etc., which again opens up an entire empire to the resources that were unavailable. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and go to, skip ahead and talk a little bit about what is the origins of the Ottoman Empire. When we talk about the origins of the Ottoman Empire, we have to begin with the rise of what I call the Turkic people coming out of Central Asia and ultimately into the Middle East. Okay? And there were many tribes that came from Central Asia, particularly in the 9th and 10th centuries, for a variety of different reasons, for economic reasons and political reasons. But the most famous of these tribes was known as the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuk, meaning that's the head of the family, which gave rise to a very important empire. And as you can see in the green, well, not yet, as you can see in the green here, the ultimate area of coverage by the Seljuks was pretty massive. The Seljuk Turks are the ones who also began to develop madrasas in what is today Iran and Iraq to promote Sunni Islam, particularly a particular form of legal aspects, namely the Shafi or the Hanafi schools of thought. The Seljuks continued to develop and move westward. Finally, as you can see, the Seljuk Empire continued to move westward, pushing the domains of Byzantium out and ultimately defeating Byzantium in Anatolia. And here's some pictures of Seljuk coins that we can still find. Now, the westward movement of the Seljuks and other Turks were led by what we call Ghazis, which were basically warriors who were trying to promote greater and greater territory on behalf of their particular families in the name of religion. So they're promoting a Ghazi, or a war, or a jihad is the other term that's often used in Arabic. And here's a couple of pictures of what the Ghazis looked like. They're very excellent cavalrymen, and cavalry was one of the main sources of using military advantages to defeat their enemies, particularly the Byzantines and other groups and so forth. Okay, so by the time we get to about the 12th, 13th century, you can see here from this map that the various sort of Turkish groups have gone from this area that came out into the Middle East and pushed westward here. So that finally we have one of the more important Turkish dynasties called the Seljuk Rum, or the Sultanate of Rum, based in central Anatolia, with its capital at Konya. And these are also important Turkish dynasties and groups that existed prior to the Ottomans. So the Ottomans just don't come out of nowhere, right? They don't come in a vacuum. They come out of this long history of Turkish movement and so forth. And here's some still remaining relics that you can find of the Seljuks, the famous mosque of Eboo Patel in Konya, and some of the highlands and hills of the Anatolian countryside and the valley. Today, that's one of the most famous mosques in downtown Konya. And this is the famous shrine of Jalaluddin Rumi in Konya. And this is the water, ablution fountain outside. And this is the entrance to his tomb. As you can see on the top, it says, Ya Hazrat Maulana. And that's his tomb right there. That's Rumi's tomb in Konya. And every year in December, there's a very famous festival that takes place called the Shabi Uruz, in which the followers of the Mevleviya Sufi order, which was the Sufi order started by him and his family, come together and perform their sama, or ceremony. And here they're about to begin right there. So one last picture. This is what Anatolia looks like before the rise of the Ottomans. As you can see, you've got different groups of Turks here all alongside here was a family led by a guy by the name of Osman. Okay? Osman sort of had his little territory carved out, which is right over here. Okay? And that little territory will ultimately give rise to one of the greatest dynasties and largest dynasties in history. Okay, so just briefly, a quick overview. Technically speaking, the Ottoman Empire lasts from 1299 to 1923. As I mentioned, it's of Turkish-based origin. It encompassed 3 main continents, Europe, Asia, Africa. And believe it or not, it had large territories of people that were belonging to non-Muslims, meaning outside of Islam. It was a dynastic rule family, so it was started by Osman and his descendants. Politically, religiously, it was often viewed as a sultanate or later on as a caliphate, which is, of course, questionable because certain Muslims did not accept them as being the head of the Muslim community in the form of a caliphate. Others did, so those are always in dispute. The initial capital, as I mentioned, was right here, which is in Bursa, little town out here. And then later on, it was changed to Edirne, and finally, Istanbul became its capital in 1453. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see. Let me skip some areas here. Okay. I'm going to sort of skip quickly over some historical events, but just mention some of the more important events, is that you begin to see Osman Ghazi begin to consolidate his power in the year 1301, where in 1326 he begins to conquer various towns and finally conquest Bursa. 1389 is a very important year for our purposes today because that's the year in which a Serbian leader by the name of Lazar was defeated by Sultan Murad. And 1389 is important because 600 years later, in 1989, Slobodan Milosevic began his power base in that year when he gave a speech on the anniversary of the defeat of Prince Lazar in Kosovo, and basically arguing about how this land needs to be reclaimed by the Serbs and so forth. So it's a very important date for Serbs in history. As you can see, there's that little island of Osman's territory. Eventually, he's going to conquer all this area, his descendants. Okay. All right. There's a period about 100 years later after Osman Ghazi begins, in which the Ottoman Empire actually collapses. It collapses, and that period is known as the Interregnum, in which he's defeated by both some of his rivals, but more importantly by another warlord from the east called Timur, known in English as Tamerlane. And he's and the Sultan at the time, whose name is Bayazid, he's imprisoned and ultimately dies in the captivity of Timur. And there's a complete breakdown of authority, and a civil war ensues between his descendants. And it looks like as if the Ottoman Empire is not going to last. It's going to be over relatively soon. But somehow they're able to make a dramatic recovery. There he is, Bayazid. The reason he's called a thunderbolt is because he was able to consolidate his power from both the Balkan areas as well as the Anatolian basin. But ultimately he was defeated then. Okay, let's go to one of the most famous Ottoman sultans known as Fatih, or Mehmed II, who conquers Constantinople. And as you can see in this picture, this is his most famous portrait right here. And here's a picture of him riding gallantly to victory in Istanbul or Constantinople. And in the museum there, in the military museum, there's actually a sort of an image of him here as well. And when he conquers Istanbul, he really converts a city that was sort of dilapidated and falling apart to one of the leading centers of commercial life as well as civilizations in history. And as you can see, he also was the cause of conquering the Hagia Sophia, and they began to put up these minarets around it. And the painting on the left is a picture of Sultan Mehmed conferring the authority of the Orthodox people to the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church. So the Greek Orthodox Church continued to remain in Istanbul as the head of all Greek Orthodox Christians. He also developed, for commercial purposes, the Grand Bazaar, as you can see here. which has a lot of different things that you can buy, including pottery and so forth. He built a famous Fatih Mosque, which is named after him. It's a beautiful complex. And then also this very famous mosque called the Eyüp Sultan Mosque, which is considered one of the holiest sites in all of Istanbul. And then a little later, a little less than a century, his descendants continue to develop greater and greater territory. And one of the most important ones is Selim I, who, unlike his predecessor that had conquered mainly Anatolia and the Balkans and Eastern Europe, Selim goes and conquers territories in the Middle East and conquers Egypt and what's called today Palestine by defeating the Mamluks, who had pretty much been ruling that area. And then later on, in that same period of time, he conquers also the Hijaz. So in effect, the Ottomans become the sort of custodians, if you will, of the two holy places of Mecca and Medina. So he not only goes and conquers the continuous Christian rivals in the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe basin, but then he goes and conquers other Muslim territories. And also his descendants later on fight other Muslim rivals such as the Safavids and so forth. His son, Suleiman the Magnificent, he's called because it is really the apogee of Ottoman political power, economic power, and cultural power where he sort of rules for about 40 years, a very long time. And this is the famous mosque named after him, the Suleymaniye. There's the courtyard of the Suleymaniye. It's kind of hard to see in the slide here, but that's the interior of the Suleymaniye Mosque. And you can begin to see a little bit of the dome here. This dome at this time was considered the largest dome of all the mosques in the Muslim world. It's really a massive sort of complex. And of course, stained windows is very unique to Ottoman architecture. You don't find it in most Muslim cultures except this one. And of course, this complex is surrounded by a cemetery, where in fact his tomb is, meaning Sultan Suleiman's. That's it. And there's the one with the big hat is his. Okay. All right. Later on, the Ottomans begin to continue to develop their power, not just in terms of their land warfare, but also develop a very powerful navy. And they begin to control different aspects of the Mediterranean Sea and later on in the Indian Ocean to rival the Portuguese, who had gone around the Horn of Africa and landed in both India, but also on the Arabian Gulf Coast as well. We can talk about that later. So by the end of the 17th century, you begin to see that the Ottomans have gone from this little area that Osman Ghazi had conquered to this massive empire. So you can see all of here, Eastern Europe. This is probably today this constitutes about 17 European countries, maybe 15 European countries. And of course, all the states, the Turks, the Arabs, the Persians, all in Egypt, in Palestine, North Africa, just a massive sort of empire, which means you need a lot of money and a lot of central authority to govern. Okay, I got some pictures of the Topkapi Palace, which is nice to look at, but there's not much to say except that that was the palace that they built in Istanbul. Oh, this is the famous Blue Mosque. And does anybody know why they call it the Blue Mosque? Because it doesn't look blue, does it? Why? What's that? Yeah, it's because of the blue tiles. These tiles here, all around. Yeah, they're made from these special, beautiful tiles that are made in Iznik. Yeah, there you go. You can see that better. Okay. Now, in the 17th century, we begin to see for the first time territorial losses suffered by the Ottomans, and two in particular. One in particular, I should say, for now, and that's the Treaty of Karlowitz, in which the Ottomans are defeated and lose territories, particularly Hungary, Croatia, to the Habsburg Empire. And then in the next century, they lose furthermore to the Russians, who are gaining ground. And this is the descendants of Peter the Great, who begin to gain more and more territories. And finally, there's a war that takes place in the late 60s, which defeat the Ottomans, and a treaty is signed called the Küçük-Kaynarca. And that's the really beginning of the end of the Ottomans in the Crimea area and the Upper Caucasus area. And then finally, around the same time, the French invade another territory, Egypt, which belonged to the Ottomans. And here's a picture of the French Navy landing near Alexandria to take over Egypt for a few years. They were there about 3 years. Ultimately, they were kicked out by the help of the British and the Ottomans. This is Napoleon leading his army near the pyramids. And then in the 19th century, we see further revolts taking place within the various provinces of the Ottomans. The Greeks revolt in the 1820s, finally gaining their independence in 1826. Russia continues to gain more territory of the Ottomans. A local vassal, governor of the Ottomans, known as Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, but he was actually an Albanian, who then begins to sort of promote his own power in Egypt and ultimately defeats an Ottoman army. So you see a sort of weakening of the military strength of the Ottomans, which then leads to all kinds of different reforms. And these reforms that begin in the 1930s in particular are known as the Tanzimat reforms. And they are reforms both militarily, education-wise, administrative-wise, and it's also the period that the famous Janissary Corps is sort of wiped out to replace with a more modern European-trained army. And as you can see, a new palace is built called the Dolmabahce Palace, which really looks more like the Palace of Versailles in France than anything that would be in Oriental nature. As you can see, very European looking, very different from the Topkapi design. Everything looks European, the furniture, the artwork, the chandeliers, and so forth. Okay, finally we come to World War I, in which the Ottomans, by this time, are very much dramatic. A lot has happened, and they decide to take the side of one of the sides in the World War I, and in particular, they decide to take, the side of the Germans. And let me begin here. In 1914, World War I begins when the Austrian heir, Franz Ferdinand, is assassinated by a Serb nationalist, part of what's known as the Black Hand. And then a whole series of events, basically a domino effect, takes place. Austria then declares war on Serbia, Germany allies with Austria, the Russians allies with their Slav cousins, the Serbs, Germany attacks France, and then the Ottomans support Germany. Now, we all have read about and know about the tremendous human suffering that occurred in World War I through literature, namely, and movies, about how much the British and the French suffered. But as you can see, in terms of statistics, Germany and France lost about 9 to 10% of its population, which is a huge number. But very rarely do you hear about the Ottoman loss. The Ottomans lost 25% of its population. And 4 of the 5 deaths were civilian, many of which that occurred due to either famine or other reasons due to the war that had begun. So the Ottomans are the biggest major losers of World War I. Now the Entente powers, as you know, are the Russian, the British, the French, and the United States, and the central are the Austrians, Germany, Ottoman. All 3 lose. And as a result of this, there are various secret treaties and deals that occur between the various victors. And the Russians are interested, and other powers are interested in gaining access to the waterways from the Black Sea, because, Russia is way over here. So in order for them to transfer goods, they can't go all the way to the Baltic up near the Arctic Circle to come down. It's too much. It's easier for them if they come straight to the Black Sea, or they're trading through the peninsula here, and then through the Straits out here. So the Russians wanted that access. And the British and the French said, okay, we'll give that to you if we win. And that's essentially what later on happens. Other secret alliances and groups took place. For example, we know that some of the local Arab chieftains sided with the British to have independence and rule for themselves. Of course, there was a famous Balfour Declaration that was promised of a Jewish homeland by the British to the European Jewry. Now, after World War I, you have the sort of emergence of new states. Okay, the new states from abroad, meaning these states were basically manufactured from outside powers, namely France and Britain, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, and Iraq. None of these states actually existed as states prior to World War I. There were other states that developed also, but these were based on different reasons. So the state, what we call today the National Republic of Turkey, basically was an independent struggle against these powers that were trying to carve it and take over. Iran comes through a coup d'etat, which was led by a strongman, Reza Shah, or Reza Khan, who named himself Reza Shah. Egypt had a revolution, and then finally the Saudi family begins its conquest of Arabia. Okay. All right. I think it's been about 30 minutes, so I'll stop there. And if you have any questions and discussions, we can get into that. And I sort of skipped also the different aspects of the empire, particularly the military class, as well as the sort of social classes and other features. But I can describe that in the question and answer and discussion. So we can open up the floor. Thank you.
Yes, I'm kind of curious. So you described this vast empire at one point, covering all kinds of territory. If you were an ordinary person in that territory, would you think of yourself as like an Ottoman? Like I think of myself as an American. You know, America covers 50 states. I think most people think of themselves as Americans, not having a strong identity to their state necessarily. So would you think of yourself as a strong identity to Ottoman, or would you have a local tribe or local governing entity, you would feel your identity is associated with that?
Right. That's an excellent question. I think it depends. For example, the Ottoman Empire, like I said, had a various different sort of levels, socially speaking. I mean, okay. So you had, for example, the Sultan and sort of his political elites that were with him. But then you also had an entire system of a military class. The military class not only was the Janissary class, which was basically the Sultan's army, personal guard, but also you had various peoples who would serve in the military, whether it was the cavalry or the infantry or the navy. All these people would consider themselves part of the Ottoman establishment and be considered the Ottomans. Okay? Then you had people in the countryside, the farmers, the agriculturalists, the artisans, and they could come from all kinds of different ethnic groups. They could be Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Arabs, Kurds, or just Turkish Muslims. So I think it depends on where they were and what level they would be. In some instances, I think everybody who was part of the military establishment, which was a huge number of people, would be considered Ottomans, but the locals, they would be considered as Armenians, but they happen to be part of the Ottoman Empire, or the Jews or the Kurds, but they would be considered part of the empire in that sense. So it would be like, if I'm from Georgia, right? What am I? Am I a Southerner? Right? Yeah. Am I from Alabama? Yeah. I'm a Georgian. Let's say I'm a Hoosier. If I'm from Indiana, I'm an American, but I have all these local and regional aspects of my existence too, which I don't want to discard, right? So I think in that sense, it was very similar in the Ottoman Empire.
Then it kind of went downhill. It doesn't exist anymore. So why did the Europeans gain the edge? In other words, history could have gone the other way. They could have just moved into the rest of Europe period. But Europe came back at them. So what was the problem? Why did they fall behind?
Well, that's a good question, but I think it sort of assumes certain ideas which may not necessarily be true, which is an empire can't last forever, all right? So whether it lasts 100 years or 600 years, sometime an empire has to basically decline due to all kinds of reasons, political, economic, social, lack of cohesion, things like that, right? So, for example, a lot of people, particularly those who are extreme nationalists in the United States, say that the American country or the nation or the empire is the greatest empire in history. But we've only been around for 200 years. So we're only essentially, a third of the way the Ottomans have lasted in terms of historical dynamics, right? So there's no assumption, I don't think, that an empire has to last a certain particular number of years to say that, it's great or whatever. So that's one issue. The second issue is that I think the Europeans were able to develop a tremendous economic power base by the discovery of the New World in North America and South America, which gained for them three things. Number one was massive slave labor in the Caribbeans and elsewhere. Second was access to important spices like sugar, tobacco, molasses, cotton. Again, based upon slave labor, which basically reduced the costs so much so that other producers of these products could not compete in the international market. Okay? And finally, free gold and silver. So when the Spanish, for example, conquered the Incas and so forth, they have massive amounts of silver and gold at their disposal, which they can use for purpose of selling or for bartering other goods. So I think that the Europeans were fortunate that they had these other economic outlets and markets that they were able to use to their advantage, whereas the Ottomans were sort of, landlocked to a certain extent, except when the fact that they did have some control over the trade, particularly from, I would say, Southeast Asia and India into the Red Sea, the Gulf of Arabia, for purpose of trade, but mostly for Hajj transport as well as commercial there. But they weren't able to keep up with that same use of, I think, extra economic activity, which then was used to develop more higher technology, particularly in the form of military technology. There was a question in the back. Yeah.
Considering that the greater princes at the time when the Turks were coming in were predominantly
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first one.
Considering that the Arabian Peninsula at that time was predominantly Muslim in nature, what was the culture, what was the climate in which the Turks were going to war or fighting? Why were they engaged in certain combats with this particular piece of land?
Oh, I see. Well, let me just kind of clarify one thing. We talked a little bit about the Mamluks, right? Everybody know who the Mamluks are? Anybody know? Who are the Mamluks? Who are the Mamluks? Yes? Yeah. What does Mamluk mean? What does literally mean? What does it literally mean? It means owned, right? Owned, yeah, slave, but it means owned, right? It means a slave. So the Mamluks basically took over the leadership of the Muslim, at least within that swath of the Middle East area, after the conquering of the Abbasid Caliphate by the Mongols, right? And they're famous in history because why? They stopped the Mongols in Palestine at the Battle of what's called the Ain and Jalut. And they stopped them cold. The first time the Mongols are defeated in history. So the Mamluks are very important. Anyway, so the Mamluks are there ruling what today consists mainly of Egypt and Palestine, Syria. And in order for the Ottomans to gain more access to markets, waterways, particularly towards the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, they felt that they had to basically overtake these other territories, right? So they went into battle against not only the Safavids in eastern Turkey or Anatolia and also parts of the Middle East, but also they had to go southern in the southern territories and defeat the Mamluks. It just so happened that the Mamluks were also those who were controlling the holy cities of Mecca and Medina in the Hijaz area at the time. So naturally, when they lost power to the Ottomans naturally went and conquered those areas. But they also did it for religious reasons, because they, by this time, were so powerful that they wanted to be seen as the representatives of the Muslim world. And how do you do that? How can you become the representative of the Muslim world when you have so many disparate factions and different ethnic groups and dispersed all over geographically? One way is to control the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, right? So that was the sort of idea there. So both for economic, political, strategic reasons, but also for religious reasons. That's why they conquered that territory. But they went up against also a group that came out in the 18th century, or I should say the late 18th, early 19th century, which were known as the followers of Ibn Saud and Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who challenged the Ottomans in the Hijaz region. And there were several decades of warfare between these two groups that lasted as well. But they were ultimately defeated by the Ottomans.
Last question?
I really like your explanation of historiography, because I've always thought of it as the ways in which people write history rather than the methods. Can you address how those two things are intertwined? How the writing, the actual writing of history rather than the methods of gathering the information?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer that, because I myself am not a historian. I think it takes a certain level of historian to write this. But I think one thing that's important is that there's this sort of debate going on within academic circles between the idea of whether history is really a science or not. Okay? In other words, it's the idea of certain social sciences and the humanities, whether they can utilize and obtain knowledge or facts based upon certainty under a scientific method. So what historians have been doing in the past 30, 40 years is to try to utilize certain kinds of methodologies to arrive at certain conclusions based upon the most appropriate scientific method. So that would include utilizing all kinds of things that I talked about. Documents about land grants, documents about waqfs or foundations, treatises, all kinds of literature, and use that amalgam of information, and from that create a broad-based either a historical overview or use it for the purposes of simply making a particular conclusion about a particular issue. For example, the role of women. What was the role of women? The traditional European view of women in the Ottoman period is all these women sitting behind a harem at the Sultan's palace, and that was it. Okay? But recent research has demonstrated that that's not really true. Women played an increasingly important political role. In fact, there's a period in Ottoman history called the Sultanate of Women, which were dominated by the mothers-in-law of some of these sultans, for example, for both foreign policy purposes and making decisions of going to war or not. But also just very average women who, were scholars or who ran business operations and economic operations of a locality. And how did they do that? They do it by land grant registers, which included names of people who were selling land, purchasing land, or other records of marriage and divorce. Okay, so for example, when a wealthy woman got a divorce, the records may contain the transaction that she took from the husband, or vice versa. Or inheritance papers, which showed the transfer of massive amounts of wealth and property from one generation to another generation. Okay? So scholars would use all that and write a monograph that would argue for a particular argument about the role of women, for example, as opposed to a broad-based history that tells you this particular empire went from point A to point B. Okay. I hope that answers your question. So I know it was a little convoluted, but... Yes.
Okay. Could you sum up the reasons for the demise of Ottoman Empire? That they so rise of Europe, the discovery, nationalism, and on, just, political opinion that was major reasons for the downfall of the demise of the empire.
Well, that's a tough question because there's no consensus amongst the Ottoman scholars and historians as to why this occurred. There's all kinds of debates and arguments. But I think some of the reasons you highlighted are sort of play a part in that, right? In other words, in the 18th, 19th century, you had the rise of all these other European, smaller, more administrative, efficient, highly technological states in Europe, such as Germany, France, Britain, and Russia, that were able to be more efficient in the use of technology and economic resources. And of course, nationalism in the 19th century created an idea within people that they no longer felt obliged to be part of this Ottoman Empire. That I want to be a Serbian, whereby Serbs rule over their own territories, or I want to be a Greek and have my own territory, and I don't want these Ottomans telling me what to do. Or, in the case of the 20th century, I want to be a local Arab chieftain and not have the Ottomans tell me what to do. So nationalism certainly did play a major role with respect to gaining a further disintegration of the sort of entire polity of the Ottoman Empire. But I would say also other kinds of reforms, like the Tanzimat reforms that began in the 30s, and a push for more democratic ideas. So, for example, in 1876-77, a constitution was pushed forth and established. And then in response to that, Abdul Hamid II reacted very strongly, dismissed the parliament, and then a new constitution was developed under the Young Turk movement in the 20th century in 1906. So you had a lot of internal dynamics which questioned the notion of the political elite, outside powers gaining more and more inroads, and of course local ethnic groups vying for independence and so forth. And I think all these contributed to that.
This is the enters and emphasizes the national Turkish movement of this integration. Even the Arab shifting was something actually the Arabs were quiet and all their performance, leaders of Shidra and Awaki and all that actually they were accepting the Ottomans, they were all the time the Muslims, the Arabs.
Yeah, that's true.
And the Arab nationalism rose up and
well, I think ultimately it was really World War I. If the Ottomans, for example, didn't choose to side with Germany, we still may have an Ottoman, we don't know, but we may still have an Ottoman Empire. So, right, right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'll stick around if you have some questions and so forth.
Before we took the break, you had something up there which we about that after the First World War. Say just a little bit more about that.
Okay.
It wasn't so much the loss, it was what was wrong with those.
The secret deals?
Yes.
Okay. Here's the idea. We have World War I. Okay. We recently had Iraq, right? We had the war in Iraq by the U.S. government, right? So there's always secret deals by government officials. They never tell the press. They don't tell us. Okay? We always find out 10, 20, 30 years after the fact. So we can conclude that the United States have secret deals with China, Russia, Britain, France, whoever, about what to do with the oil that's coming out of Iraq. Who's going to purchase the oil from Iraq? Who's going to be able to negotiate for the purchase of Iraq, right? All these kinds of things. Similarly, Britain, France, and the Russians, and others, the Serbs, the Greeks, also had negotiations about what to do if they win and the Germans, Austrians, and Ottomans lose. Everybody wanted the Ottomans. Why? Because the Ottomans was the biggest power remaining and lots of territories. So you had certain deals, secret alliances about who's going to take what, right? And that's what really I was sort of alluding to. But it occurred at the government level, so Britain and France, right? Russia and France. You had maybe bilateral treaties, multi-party treaties at that level. There was a second level. A second level occurred between groups So the British sort of signed or accepted the famous Balfour Declaration between them and leaders of the Jewish community to give Jews a homeland, right? So that was a separate sort of agreement that was not disclosed to the public immediately until much later. It's actually, it was supposed to be a secret, and someone basically reported to the press, and then it went sort of viral, as they say. Okay? And then you also had secret deals with local Muslim leaders too. Okay, so the British made an alliance with the Sharif Hussein, and so forth. So you had all these different things going on. Once that war was over, then you had the emergence of these states through various methods. One was called the mandate system, which basically meant that the French were able to politically and economically control Syria and Lebanon, the British, Palestine, and Arabia. Okay? And just, I'll conclude with this, sorry. And this is an interesting story because you're all sort of familiar with this. And that you've all seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, right? The famous story about, this handsome British diplomat goes in and raises the revolt against the Turks through the use of these alliances. And this is what we're talking about. Okay? The person at issue is this guy named Sharif Hussein, who are the Sharifs of Mecca. These are the people who are the political leaders of Mecca. And his son, Faisal, played by Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? Okay? So they go ahead and conquer Damascus, right? So Faisal conquers Damascus, and what does he expect? He expects that he's going to be the ruler of Damascus, maybe the king of Damascus. But what happens? The French say, sorry, you're out. We're going to control Damascus. And they actually invade and conquer and bomb Damascus in the 1920s. Okay, so they depose him. And then he has another son, meaning Sharif Hussein has another son named Amir Abdullah. Okay? He goes to, marches to Damascus to avenge his brother. Okay, they're defeated, all right? So there's a Treaty of Cairo in 1921. So what do? Okay, this Treaty of Cairo basically gives territories in lieu of payment for helping. Instead of giving them money, gold, they say, we'll give you territories. Okay? So what do we do with poor Faisal? He fought for the British. The French kick him out of Syria. So what are we going to do? Let's give him something called Iraq. So we'll create something called Iraq. And we'll give him a territory that we create called Iraq. Now, why is Iraq the shape that it's in? Is it just because we like this strange-looking, diagram? No. It's because the entire territory that's carved out is premised upon 3 British interests. Basra, because it gives access to the crown jewel of the British, India, the ports of India. Mosul, because oil has been discovered now by this time. And finally, Baghdad, because that is the breadbasket of the Middle East. It has tremendous agriculture. So they give and create this territory called Iraq, and they give it to Faisal, knowing that they will ultimately be in alliance with him and have control over these 3 important things. All right? But what they didn't count on was, of course, all these problems that will occur. The sectarian divisions. Number one, Iraq is the majority of people who live in Iraq are Shiites. And if you have a Sunni called Faisal who governs them, it's going to create issues. Okay? And all kinds of problems. There's a Kurdish nationalism that's brewing that they didn't take into account. They completely ignored them and so forth. Okay, so that kind of explains that.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Actually, were they religious, dualists, or was that violent strategy, like putting a Sunni rule over Shia?
Oh, they didn't care. I mean, they were sort of like, we got to give Faisal something, so let's give him, because there's by the World War I, all the states are taking up powers, right? I mean, territories. The British have their territories, the French do, and the Ottomans are lost, and they're too busy trying to maintain their independence and maintain Istanbul, and so forth. So basically, they say, okay, we'll just give them this territory. Yeah, do you want to comment on that? Right. 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 So the 2 brothers got, it's like the greatest real estate deal for the family ever made. Right. Right. Because this notion of Transjordan, what's Transjordan? has there ever been a notion of Transjordan history? So instead, they gave Transjordan to create this fiction of Transjordan to this guy, the brother of Faisal, Abdullah, right? And he is the great-grandfather of today's King Abdullah, right? So in other words, this is why the Ottoman Empire is so important. That's the conclusion from this, is because it has obviously cultural aspects, but very important historical aspects. If you did not know what happened in the Balkans with the Ottomans, you would be completely clueless about what happened with the Balkans in the 1990s and why there was so much animosity towards the Turks by the Serbs and so forth. So this is really important things. And this, just to sort of finish up really quickly, I got this idea of teaching, or at least talking about the Ottomans, because when I was talking to my son who's in high school about his Western civilization class, and I asked him, are you guys covering the Ottomans? He said, well, not really, we're just going to touch upon it a little bit. And I thought to myself, you're having a course on Western civilization in the year 2012, and they hardly touch on the Ottomans? And that's the problem with education in the system. Yeah. All right. Sorry, thanks for being patient.